Hello, this is Ralph K. Ginorio. Welcome to the 28th installment of my video lesson adaptation of my history behind the 9/11 terror atrocities. We have passed the fulcrum point into the contemporary world. 1973 is that fulcrum point. The Yom Kippur War makes us the prime enemy of the Arab and Islamist forces in the war on terror. They realize that in order to defeat Israel, they must first somehow get the United States out of the region, neuter it, or damage it so badly that we cannot come like the proverbial cavalry to protect the Israelis again. Also in 1973, the first of the Arab oil embargoes artificially inflates the price of oil to such an extent that Western economies are broken and have to reform in a more austere model. This changes society in Western Europe and in the United States, and it impoverishes us relative to what we had been before 1973. So let's take events as they unfold in this shiny, bright new world. First off, Palestinian terrorists seize a plane in that most secure of European airports, Athens Airport, in 1976. And they fly the airliner to Entebbe, Uganda, which is ruled by General and President Field Marshal Idi Amin Dr. Idi Amin Dada, a former Royal African Rifle boxing champion who took over by overthrowing his predecessor and successor, General Obote. Amin was and is notorious as one of the truly most bloody-handed, worst African dictators to arise after the departure of the European colonial empires. And Amin became a Muslim. He ended his days after being overthrown in Uganda in Saudi Arabia, and he was a frequent Haji to Mecca. So Amin hosts the terrorists, providing them with the protection of his forces and a secure place from which to negotiate. The terrorists release all the non-Israeli passengers and get prepared to start executing the Israeli passengers in a very bloody-handed and public fashion. Well, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and the Prime Minister decide that they are going to stop this. And they take some big chances to do so. Uganda is north of Lake Victoria in East Central Africa. Between Israel and Uganda are thousands of miles of enemy territory. The Egyptians are hostile to Israel. The Sudanese are hostile to Israel. Basically, the only way they can get flyover rights is to go through Kenya and hope that diplomats in Kenya will allow a brief flyover so the Israeli planes can gain access to landlocked Uganda. On July 4th, 1976, Happy American Independence Day, the Israelis land at Entebbe, kill the terrorists, and rescue the hostages for the most part. One woman had been taken to a Uganda hospital. No doubt she was tortured to death after the raid, and the only Israeli casualty was Yani Netanyahu, the elder brother of the current Prime Minister of Israel. Operation Thunderbolt, the raid on Entebbe, was a swimming success, and most Americans cheered the Israelis on as they fought what seemed to be an international crime wave to most Americans as they were trying to wrap their heads around this notion of state-sponsored terrorism. In the late 1970s, one of the truly amazing and good things that I, a conservative Republican, believe President James Earl Carter did for the world was he capitalized on a peace initiative between the Egyptian President Anwar el-Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister, former Irgun leader, Menachem Begin. Sadat, after the Yom Kippur War, sells to his people the notion that in fact Israel was beaten by the Egyptian army, and it was only after they took American help that the tables were able to turn. And this is in fact true. So the Egyptian army, from a position of pride, as the only Arab or Islamic force ever to really make a dent in Israel's military fortunes, can negotiate from a position of relative strength. And he initiates, with Begin, a series of visits to one another's capital, and ultimately President Carter decides to back this process and invites both Begin and Sadat to the presidential retreat in the mountains of Maryland at Camp David. I remember the night the Camp David Accords were announced. I'm a science fiction fan. The first Battlestar Galactica movie was being broadcast, and just at the climactic moment, it was interrupted by these politicians. Well, I actually knew what the Camp David Accords were about, and I appreciated that it was a historical moment. It is the only genuine peace treaty that both sides have honored the spirit of between an Arab and Islamic force on the one hand and the Jewish state on the other. I remember the ceremony where they shook hands and signed, and President Carter gave his trademark smile, and for once I was pleased and happy with President Carter's presidency. The terms of the agreement were that Israel would give up the Sinai Peninsula and retreat back to its national border, and that this phased withdrawal would happen, that both Egypt and Israel would receive munificent American aid, and that the Egyptian army and Egypt in general was going to stay out of future Arab-Israeli wars. Now, this is huge, because without the Egyptian army, the Arabs have no chance of beating Israel in conventional warfare. None. So once the Camp David Accords is signed, the Arabs are forced to either engage in diplomacy or terrorism. And the only thing that's threatened this, well, there are two things that threatened this. For his troubles as a peacemaker with the Israelis, Anwar el-Sadat was murdered by his own Islamist bodyguards in 1980. His successor, General Hosni Mubarak, kept the peace from 1980 until his overthrow just a few years ago. Now, Mubarak was not perfect, nor was the Shah of Iran, but both of those men honored their agreements and brought their countries a bit further into the modern world, which also offends the Islamists. Mubarak was trustworthy when it came to keeping the peace with Israel. And without Egypt involved, there is no profit in an Arab-Israeli war on the kind of scale we saw in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s. So Camp David changes everything in the Middle East. And since Sadat's successor kept that peace, it has still changed it to the present day. The second thing that threatens the effectiveness of the Camp David Accords was the overthrow of Mubarak by the so-called forces of the Arab Spring, which brought about a government run by the Muslim Brotherhood, a terror organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel. Their president Morsi was laying the stage for bringing Egypt once again into the field, and had that happened, we would have looked at another major full-scale tank air-sea battle rather than a battle with terrorists. That would have brought death on a massive scale. Luckily, earlier this year, Egyptian army forces took over in a coup against Morsi. But the jury is still out. There's instability in Egypt, and there's great hatred for the Arab-Israeli Accords and the Camp David Accords on the streets of Cairo. So, Egypt is out of the picture, and terrorism seems to be the only way to proceed. 1979 is a watershed year too. First off, President Carter, because the Shah of Iran was not perfect, because the Shah of Iran did use means of oppression against his enemies, much the same as President Obama did not like Mubarak of Egypt because he used rough measures against his enemies. President Carter allowed the Shah of Iran to fall. And in his place appeared the government of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, an Islamist government that proclaims the first Islamist republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And within months of taking power, students take over the American embassy, run by Chargé d'Affaires in Tehran. These students, far from being besieged by the Iranian authorities, are lauded as heroes by the Iranian authorities, and they proceed to parade Americans in blindfolds, beaten in front of the world press. Now, one of these students bears a remarkable resemblance to the former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Yep. President of Iran, former president of Iran, personally was involved in the American hostage crisis. Look at the pictures and you will see. So, the American nation is visited in the international media with images of Americas beaten and bowed and led around on ropes. And for months, we tried diplomacy. The Iranians have no interest in giving these hostages up. The Iranians are getting all sorts of goodies. They're getting strong press. They're becoming the leaders of the anti-Western world in the Third World. They are getting all sorts of power and prestige. They have no interest in giving up these people. And then about halfway through 1980, President Carter finally decides that he's going to do something besides diplomacy. And he establishes, or he gives a go-ahead to a military plan to get the hostages out. But President Carter had systematically defunded the American military for 3 years. And the American military dropped the ball, in part because of consistently lower budgets than they needed, which was the choice of that administration. So, on our way to Tehran, at a mid-desert fueling point that we labeled Desert 1, a disaster occurs. A crash by one of our aircraft is observed by a bus full of Iranian tourists, and we end up leaving Iran with wrecked aircraft on the ground that Iranians are doing the woo-woo-woo call over the next morning in the international media. Not only did we engage in a military attack, which was so horrifying to then Secretary of State Cyrus Vance that he resigned, but we botched it. So the hostage crisis goes on every night. Ted Koppel led the news with Dave Blapp, America held hostage. The 1980 election plays out. In the height of the election season, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. So we look weak across the board. Actually, the invasion may have happened just after the election, so I will withdraw that. In the election, President Carter is defeated by conservative Ronald Reagan. Reagan, between the election and his inauguration next January, starts publicly using words like savages to describe the Iranian hostage takers. He uses undiplomatic language and intimates that he will use the full power of the American military to punish the Iranians if certain things were not done. On his inauguration day, as he's sitting down to a chicken luncheon after taking the oath of office, he gets the word that the hostages have left Iranian airspace. The hostage crisis is over. Now, most Americans sigh relief. Whew, that's done. Well, it maybe have been done for most Americans, but for our terrorist enemies, it was only the beginning of a struggle that has been ongoing since the 1970s up until the present day. They didn't stop fighting us when they released our hostages. They simply altered their means. As I said earlier, in 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan to try to put a puppet regime on it, and for the next decade, we pay them back for Vietnam. We bleed their army the way they bled us. We give the Mujahideen, the holy warriors of God, Stinger missiles to shoot down their aircraft, just as they gave the North Vietnamese army anti-aircraft missiles to shoot down our aircraft. We paid them back for Vietnam. We inflicted a lot of casualties on the Red Army in Afghanistan from 79 to 89. And we did so with allies that would later come back to bite us. But the main enemy was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was far more dangerous to the freedom and peace of the world than any Arab terrorist thus far, except maybe Gavrilo Princip. And the enemy of your enemy is sometimes your ally. So at the end of the Afghanistan war, we claimed victory because American know-how was involved. But the Mujahideen, which included Osama bin Laden and many future founding members of Al-Qaeda, they claimed victory, as did the Afghani country boys, because they were the ones that actually did the fighting on the ground. The war of terrorism continues. In 1982, Lebanon destabilizes. The Syrians try making it into a colony. Then, as now, the Syrians are basically a colony of the Iranians, aided by the Russians. So, we decide that we're going to intervene. We're going to interpose ourselves between the Syrian forces on the one hand, Israeli forces that had invaded Lebanon from the south on the other, and Palestinian forces that were in retreat from Lebanon. When American Marines land, they're supported by one of the World War II era battleships, a very impressive sight. But a few weeks later, American Marines that for some reason were housed in a high-rise barracks, well, they didn't awake. There was a screech, there was a screaming van that went through American defenses into the lobby and exploded. The suicide bombing killed over 200 American Marines. What do? What does my hero, President Reagan, do? They killed our people, we go away. We left. We taught the enemy that if they kill our people, we might go away. That strategy, kill enough Americans and we'll go away, was tried by the Japanese in World War II. From the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal to the very end of the war, to the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, they gambled, if they kill enough Americans, we'll go away. It didn't work. In Korea, the Chinese gambled that if they kill enough Americans, we'll go away. The bloodiest 2 years of the war were us holding a line, demonstrating to the Chinese that we'd stay long enough to hold that line. And that brought us the ceasefire that we still have today. Only in Vietnam did the enemy actually get results by killing enough Americans, and thanks to the anti-war movement, they were given victory. They killed a lot of Americans, and we went away. Well, in Beirut, Lebanon, in 1982, President Reagan taught the Islamists that we were vulnerable to that sort of pressure. That if you kill enough of us, we'll go away. And this, like the example of the Maccabees, that fighting the overwhelming world empire is an honorable thing, and if God is with you, who can stand against you? Like the example of Masada, better death than surrender. When they kill us, and when we go away, we give a bully what they want. We give victory to an enemy that has gone out of their way to harm us. Next time, the rise of modern Al-Qaeda.